After my introduction, I will open up the session for questions. At that time, you will be able to type a question in the text box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. We have more than 450 attendees signed up for this webinar, and I would ask you to bear with us. It will not be possible to answer all the questions we receive in the time available. Please keep your questions short and on one subject if possible. This will let me give answers to as many as I can during the session. We have already received some questions by email, and so after my introduction, Laura will start by reading these out, and I will reply to these first. Okay, let's start. The Principal Designer's Handbook. First of all, we are very pleased to have produced this handbook, which is primarily aimed towards the needs of the single practitioner or small and medium-sized businesses who offer principal designer services either as a standalone service or in addition to other design services. It echoes the APS mission statement to support the design and construction health and safety industry, and in particular, those who have been thrust into a duty holder role with little previous experience. The handbook is intended to assist the industry achieve a proportionate response to health and safety design risk management in the pre-construction phase. It will assist newcomers to understand the role and perhaps seek advice initially, and will also help those who have sufficient health and safety skill, knowledge and experience to carry out the principal designer role, but are new to small projects and domestic work in particular. So there were a couple of points there. Firstly, the handbook is a quick first point of reference. It is not intended to be a vast encyclopedia covering all eventualities. It is not meant to be a manual for those parts of the industry who are up to speed with CDM and the principles of design risk management. The handbook contains many diagrams and other illustrations to amplify the text. It is well documented that it is the smaller projects where most of the concerns have been identified by HSE, and it is those projects where most harms occur to workers. The issue driving CDM 2015 was these small project concerns, and this is where APS have concentrated our initial effort. The handbook is a useful tool for both new principal designers and experienced design risk practitioners now becoming involved with smaller and previously non-notifiable projects. That is why there are sections on domestic projects, partial services and self-build, many of which previously did not require the appointment of a design phase coordinator. Secondly, the handbook is intended to assist the smaller end of the industry achieve a proportionate response to health and safety design risk management in the pre-construction phase. The smaller end of the industry has been identified as, firstly, the greatest cause of accidents, and secondly, the sector that is least conversant with CDM and the management of risk. The message here is to keep it simple. The Principal Designer's Handbook is the first textbook specifically covering the role to be published. A CDM 2015 guide has been published, but for the most part, this deals with the differences between CDM 2007 and CDM 2015. A total of 26 pages cover the red, amber and green descriptions. Now this is very useful information, and there are elsewhere in that particular book some very interesting propositions and examples. But we did not want to either regurgitate information already freely available, such as the HSE's L153 and the various guides, or indeed the CDM 2015 guide that was published. The editorial team, which for APS comprised 2 architects and 2 engineers, were aiming to produce a straightforward guide to the principal designer role, told in terms of the design and construction process, the RIBA and other industry standard plans of work, for example, which follow a logical project-based sequence. We have been asked frequently why there has been such a delay in publishing the handbook. Initially, the intention was to have the handbook available for around the time of the launch of CDM 2015 in April 2015. Authorship had commenced in late 2014, but by April, the document was seen to be growing considerably in content, trying to be all things to all people, and this simply did not work. And importantly, even at this time, the handbook was far from complete. By July, it was time for APS to reassess the objectives for the handbook and draw on experience of APS and its members, which would not have been possible if the handbook had been launched shortly after the regulations changed. It was more than self-evident that after the initial release of the new regulations, there were a number of significant issues raised, and I will highlight a few of these. Who could be a principal designer? Who was the designer? Did that mean somebody with a degree in design? Why was the contractor undertaking client duties on domestic projects? What happened before they were appointed? What about planned and reactive maintenance? What about self-build projects? Was the supply of capable individuals and businesses enough to meet the demand? The Principal Designer's Handbook addresses these questions. APS was first to recognise the absolute need for health and safety practitioners who were not designers to step up and assist clients and designers. The non-statutory roles, CDM advisor to client and CDM advisor to principal designer, now both recognised by HSE, were identified as required to meet initial demand at the very least. These developments, all of which occurred over the first 6 months or so, the transitional period, had a material effect on the content of the handbook, which has been issued to reflect the experiences of actually implementing the regulations. In order that the book was not locked in time or out of date after a few months or even years, it was decided to release a paper and a digital version. The digital version can be updated from time to time by APS as experience of implementing CDM 2015 grows. It was also decided that the APS website could be utilised as an additional resource where information, exemplars and other documents could be located, allowing information in the handbook to be expanded, but importantly, kept up to date. Some of this has not gone exactly to plan. The digital version of the handbook has been delayed due to document formatting issues, but is expected to be available by mid-February. This is almost complete now. The exemplar and sample documents for the website are also not complete for upload, but these are currently being compiled and should be available in March. The Principal Designer Handbook covers who can be Principal Designer, the Principal Designer role. This provides an overview of the role, details the key responsibilities, and outlines how they differ on commercial and domestic projects. The Principal Designer in Practice includes details on fees and appointments, pre-construction information, design risk management, and how to prepare a health and safety file. Liaison with the Principal Contractor. This includes details of the construction phase plan, the continuing liaison required during the construction phase, and guidance on the defects liability period. Standard and exemplar documents. This section includes fees and appointment worked examples, examples of a health and safety file, and other useful templates which will be modified and updated as experience of the regulation develops. Documents will be uploaded to the website, which will be accessible for purchasers of the book. The key CDM roles. This section outlines the key roles and responsibilities for the client, the designer, principal contractor, contractors, workers, and the CDM advisor. In other words, it also covers non-statutory roles. The paper copy of the Principal Designer's Handbook is published by RIBA Publishing and is available from APS and RIBA bookshops and other outlets, and the price is £25. When published, the digital version will be available at a price of £20, and there will be a bundled cost, paper and digital together, at £40. Thank you for listening. I will now respond to a couple of questions received to date, so if you've not already done so, please type your questions now.
Okay, so the first question is, can you expand on the duties of the principal designer in relation to the designer?
Yes, the principal designer has all the designer duties as a designer that are contained within CDM 2015. The principal designer duties are on top of those and are in relation to the management of risk through the design process.
Okay. Next question. Can you expand on the requirement of an employer to have clear procedures in place to ensure that assigned duty holders know what is expected of them?
This question will relate a great deal to the type of employer. And the question is, can we expand on the requirement of an employer to have clear procedures in place? Clearly, there will be vast differences between the informed employer, the large business who may well be conversant with CDM, and the very small one-time employer. There's a certain obligation where employers or clients, as they will be, don't have sufficient knowledge of CDM for their consultants, their principal designer and principal contractor, to keep them informed and to assist them understand the processes.
Next question. What additional knowledge, skills, experience and training would APS consider a designer would need to be a principal designer?
Not all designers will have health and safety experience, and so to move from designer to principal designer under those circumstances, the designer would be best placed in undertaking some training. I think most of you listening to this will know that the APS has a series of accredited training providers making suitable training available. What the designer needs, if they don't already have it, is knowledge and understanding of health and safety, of CDM 2015 and related subjects.
Next question. The APS published a very comprehensive and professional looking A4 ring binder for the 2007 regulations called The Guides to the Management of CDM Coordination. Why was this not updated and republished in the wake of the CDM 2015 regulations? This could have included all the principal designer's information in a format which looked far more businesslike and professional.
As I said in my introductory remarks, we started off with the CDM coordination guide with the intention of updating it, and this became too complex. It was trying to be too many things to too many people. The new regulations were clearly pointing the industry in a slightly different direction, and what I said also in my introduction was that we were looking specifically at sectors of the industry that was previously less supported and concentrating on that sector.
Okay, next question. Some of the flowcharts are confusing and not explained as well as they could be. Also, the text is very small, especially flowchart figure 1.4. Why was the book published so small when complex flowcharts and tables were going to be included?
Yes, this question refers to flowchart figure 1.4, which is currently on screen. In fact, by coincidence, it is a chart that shows the sequence of events in which a principal designer will be involved as a project develops. Now, the text is quite small, but really in that particular diagram, even with the size that the book is, it's fairly well and easily read. We did have a look at the sizing of text with our publisher, and that was addressed. There is another diagram in the book. It's, I think, diagram 2.1, which shows a drawing, an architect's drawing in this particular case, with a couple of areas indicated. It's not meant to be read, as I'm sure many of you will realize. Information on drawings is confidential to the client and their consultant, and so it's deliberately not easily read. I suppose it could be, but the point of that particular diagram is to illustrate that risk information can be included quite readily on drawings.
Okay, next question. Is the hard copy of the PD handbook in a format that can be expanded with your own notes?
I think it possibly could be, but you'd be scribbling around the edges of the pages. No, it isn't. The hard copy is 100 or so pages, in fact 102 pages. There are spaces if an owner of the handbook wished to add a few notes, but it's not designed to be expanded in that way.
Who assesses the principal contractor's construction phase plan if the client is he capable? If it's the client, sorry, I'm going to do that again. Who assesses the principal constructor's construction phase plan? If it's the client, is he capable?
Right, this is a good question, one that we've been asked many, many times. The regulations do not require that anyone assesses the principal contractor's construction phase plan. The client is expected to ensure that the plan is in place, but there is no requirement for them to look at the content, approve the content, assess the content, or anything of that nature. Similarly, there isn't a duty on the principal designer to carry out any check on the document. Clients do have duties, though, to ensure that the management of health and safety is in accordance with their requirements. And the way that we have approached this question previously is to say that the client may wish to have a CDM advisor to assist them looking at the principal contractor's response, which is the construction phase plan.
Okay, next question. Does the PD have to have the relevant PD insurance to officially be given the role?
Well, that's very straightforward. Anyone who's practicing in the design and construction industry will probably require insurance. Certainly, the principal designer will require to have professional indemnity insurance, and it should cover the role that they are playing in the same way as it would cover any other design function that they're undertaking.
Next question. Must the client review the CPP, construction phase plan, prior to work starting?
I've answered that one already. Essentially, the client has a duty to ensure that the construction phase plan is there. They don't have to review it, but they may wish to ensure that the management arrangements that they wish to see undertaken through the project are in place.
Can you give an example of a risk mitigated through design?
Well, asking me to be a designer, I gave that up a few years ago now. A risk mitigated through design. Yes, let's think of something like foundations. Foundations on a tricky site. The foundations might be initially designed as being deep piles, for example. I'm talking out of my depth here to a certain extent. It might be deep piles, and the decision might be, because of the site conditions, to change the design to a raft foundation, something like that. I mean, there will be numerous examples of how risks can be mitigated through design. It's really up to you guys to get that sorted out.
Next question. I'm a designer who has the skills, knowledge and experience to act as a PD. I've been asked to be the PD, but will not be part of the design team. How do I control the pre-construction phase plan?
Right, okay, this question from a designer who has the skills, knowledge and experience to be the principal designer. They've been asked to be the principal designer, presumably by the client, but they won't be part of the design team. Well, that's not exactly true. They will be part of the design team, but they won't necessarily be designing the project. And that's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing in the regulations that requires the principal designer to actually undertaking design on the project, but they would be part of the design team because the client would be obliged through the regulations to make the appointment, and the principal designer would become involved with the design team, and by becoming involved in that way would be controlling the pre-construction phase in terms of the design risk management.
Next question. What is the recommended action if a client refuses to have an intrusive asbestos survey carried out?
Right. Interesting. Why would a client refuse? But anyway, this is a requirement in an existing building. It is a requirement of the CAR regulations, control of asbestos regulations, that an asbestos demolition or refurbishment survey is carried out before any work is undertaken, basically. And so, what would you do if the client refuses? You would let the client understand the risks and probably inform the other designers in your team of the situation, and you would then make a commercial decision whether or not to walk away. Just be clear, though, that any refurbishment project requires an asbestos survey. It is the law.
Okay, next question. As a chartered health and safety practitioner and post-CDMC with 20 years construction experience on major projects, would I be fit for the principal designer role?
Well, yes, subject to whoever has asked this question being a designer within the terms of the regulations. Now, the regulations themselves do not require that any specific qualification applies to the term designer. So it's somebody who is designing. And the example I give, which is anecdotal, is a central heating system will be designed by a plumber. That plumber can be the principal designer because they are the designer. They will be employing a couple of other tradesmen, a joiner and an electrician to assist. They will also be the principal contractor. And on a domestic project, as a principal contractor, they would be undertaking the client duties as well. The key here is that the principal designer must be a designer. They must be a designer in business as such. But the actual definition of designer is fairly loose, and which is why I gave the example of the plumber undertaking central heating.
Okay, next question. The CDM regulations require that the client ensure that a construction phase plan is drawn up. I see no requirement in Regulation 4.5a to check suitability.
Okay, we've covered that twice already, so I think we'll pass that one.
Okay, next question. Will there be copies of the slides made available from today?
Yes, Laura reliably tells me that they will be made available. Just as an addendum to that, these slides are just abstract slides. They're not following, obviously, what I said. They're taken from the Principal Designer's Handbook, the illustrations from the book itself.
There will also be a recording of this webinar on the website, which you'll be able to download and listen to at a later date, or if any colleagues have missed that, you'll be able to listen to that afterwards. Okay, so we'll have another question. The guidance states in Schedule 2 that the client must ensure that the construction phase plan adequately addresses the arrangements for managing risks and therefore implies a review is required.
Yes, it does. We worried over this long and hard. And to a certain extent, common sense takes its position in this argument. The regulations, as I've said earlier, do not require a review. Schedule 2 may imply, but the fact of the matter is we have to go on what the regulations actually say. And I've covered the CPP review earlier. But yes, we were intrigued by why there would be no review by the instigator of the pre-construction information, if you like, because this did seem that there was a lesser standard required in this set of regulations than in the previous, which wasn't the intention.
Next question. I read a recent presentation by APS on who can be the PD, but it fails to deal with the requirement that a PD should be in control of the pre-construction phase, L153, para 94. Instead, there is an attention given to the assertion that a PD does not need to be part of the project team. How can these two contradictions be reconciled?
Right, so the question is, the presentation fails to deal with the requirement that a PD should be in control of the pre-construction phase, and this seems to compete with the assertion that the principal designer does not need to be part of the project team. Now, I did deal with that in an earlier question. Principal designer doesn't have to be designing any part of the project, and therefore they will be part of the project team, and therefore they will be in control of the pre-construction phase.
Next question. If a health and safety file for a complete building does not exist at the outset, does one need to be produced for the whole building after extension work has been carried out?
Right, this is digging a bit deeper, but yes, it's quite probable in many projects that there won't be a health and safety file available. So the health and safety file that is produced will relate to the work that is done. And so if there's an extension to a building, you would expect the health and safety file to deal with issues relative to the extension and any work associated with the extension that interfered with anything in the existing building. And that would include services and so on and so forth.
Okay, next question. How is the smaller end of the industry going to be advised and instructed in the application of the regulations and rules? Speaking to clients and contractors indicates that they have no idea how it applies to them.
Quite right. That is why, in some ways, we produced the Principal Designer's Handbook to look specifically at the smaller end of the industry. And of course, there are areas that are very difficult to reach. This is something that APS has on its forward agenda. What we think is that most of the designers in the smaller end will be getting support of some sort, either from their design institutions or from APS. But the very small contractors are unlikely to be getting support or information. And certainly in discussions that I've been having with various parties at seminars and so on and so forth, we would encourage designers to try and educate the contractors as best they can. But the bottom line answer to the question is we are looking at ways to get to those parts of the industry that are difficult to reach in order to inform.
Next question. Is it possible to provide a web link where the HSE state that CDM advisors are permitted or recognised?
Yes, it's in the HSE FAQ section. I can't remember the web link at the moment, but if you go onto HSE website, construction, if you then find the FAQs, you will see that HSE are now recognising that there is a need for CDM advisors.
Okay, next question. Not all designers have embraced the PD, mainly architects, and it's sometimes hard to get hazard and risk information from them. What could I do?
Well, this is one that I recognise, just so that you all know I am an architect. Yes, you're absolutely right, whoever asked this question. Many architects are still not really getting the hang of how to identify information to be passed on to the principal designer. What you need to do is be as persuasive as you can. That's one of the attributes that we expect a principal designer to have. Communication, able to persuade designers, able to cajole them into providing information by explaining the reasons why the information is necessary. And that is, we're trying across the board and throughout the industry to protect workers and prevent harm.
Next question. Will there be an app for PCI released similar to the CITB CDM app?
Right. I don't know what the CITB are intending here. I suspect the industry at large is looking at apps that can be downloaded one way or another for PCI and the construction phase plan. What I should say at this point is we'll just have to see how the industry responds. The structure of a PCI will be vastly different depending on the various jobs, and getting a one-size-fits-all might be difficult, but I would suggest that everyone just watches this space.
Okay, next question. Following the removal of the explicit reference to the trade qualification, how would you best suggest contractors prove their competence?
Right. I think this question applies to all qualifications. The requirement within the regulations is that all parties have skills, knowledge and experience. And it's incumbent on clients to make reasonable inquiries to ensure that whoever they're employing, whether that be a principal contractor, a principal designer, or a contractor, are capable of doing the job. Now, how they do that and what the response is very much between the parties.
Okay, next question.
There's a slight gap, and Rebecca's busy scribbling the next question down.
Okay, so from what I understood, the HSE said that understandably one of the issues which is exercising designers in terms of new regs was that their duty to ensure as a principal designer really means. Regulation and guidance suggest that this is an absolute obligation, which is obviously extremely onerous. Is this still the case?
Okay. So I'm going through this question again. The HSE said that understandably one of the issues which is exercising designers was what their duty to ensure really means. Well, that duty is, generally speaking, qualified by so far as is reasonably practicable. And these two things go together. So the principal designer does have to ensure where the regulations say ensure, but only so far as it's reasonably practicable. Now, one of the illustrations that has been flying past on the screen as I've been talking and answering these questions is a scale which shows that risk has to be balanced, decision making has to be balanced. And so that's really the essence of these regulations. The principal designer ensures so far as is reasonably practicable.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question here. You've stated that the PD does not necessarily have to be a designer. However, Table 1 in L153, Regulation 5, it states the PD is a designer. Therefore, the regs imply that the PD is a lead designer in the design process. Please clarify.
Yeah, I think we've covered this in some ways before, but okay, look, the PD does not necessarily have to be a designer. Well, that's not the case. The principal designer has to be a designer. The principal designer is a designer in business, and that is as straightforward as the regulations are. The PD does not have to be the lead designer. Lead designer is an industry term. Usually there would be an architect or a project manager or a surveyor or an engineer leading a project because they're put in the position of leading by their client. There is no direct link between the principal designer role and lead designer. The principal designer is in charge of health and safety coordination for the project. The lead designer will invariably be in charge of the technical design of the project. The two can go together. There's no block to that, but they are not intrinsically linked in any way in the regulations or elsewhere. Right, I think we've come to the end of the session. Thank you all for your questions. Some of them were interesting, some of them were a bit challenging. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. The webinar will be on the website as soon as we get it finished off. And can I remind everyone that the Principal Designer's Handbook is available from APS and RIBA bookshops as we speak. And well, good luck with it.